Hello, selectors, and welcome back to the Life Burst Podcast. We're talking about Tama this time, which I know everyone loves. But I figured since I'm in the middle of doing all the interviews for the top eight. I figured, there's probably some people who want to see the top eight breakdown for the deck tech that was the one that I won. And since I just figured, I could kind of interview myself for that that one. So this is me interviewing me, uh, and doing the breakdown of the top eight deck that I managed to pilot in the GP. I got fifth place overall, and then seventh place when you do the top eight breakdowns. Really, I don't really love dividing top eight into like top four or top player, just because after you get to top eight, it really starts being more like matchup dependent and sort of luck of where you seeded and who you seeded against. But so I got into top eight, which is basically the top that you possibly get to do with it. So I'm really impressed with how the deck functioned. There's definitely some things in looking at. What's interesting is I've always played games and had, in retrospect, being like, oh, this card wasn't good. I wish I should change it out for this one. This is the first time I've ever played an event where I looked at every single card and said, yep, every single one of them had their use and was good. There's occasionally there's some stuff I'm looking on here that I could have changed and would have helped me win top eight maybe more. But what my goal was to hit top eight and then play the top eight. But I looked at every single card in this list and decided there's not a single card I would have pulled out or changed, and for making it to top eight, it weathered almost every single thing. This is truly a 50% deck. There was I don't think there's a single matchup, with the exception of one, that I found so far that I didn't feel like wasn't a 50% fair chance for me to win. The only deck that being is the one that I actually played in top 8, which was Team Nova, which was the Super Stall deck, and was able to beat me pretty convincingly. So I would say it was like maybe this deck was like 40% favored. Maybe that 40% favored if I was on the play, and then less if I was on the draw, which ended up being kind of what happened. So inevitably, I wouldn't have changed things too much here. Let's dive deep into the deck. So I got to GP. I got to meet everyone, which was super great. I have talked about how fun the GP was before. But I was my whole goal, the whole reason I decided to go with Tama. It's not like Tama's my favorite center or anything either, or that Esper is really my favorite archetype in the world. It's actually pretty far off from my favorite stuff. It's because I wanted a 50% win rate across the board, and I wanted, for two reasons, to play a 50% deck. The first reason was I leaned pretty heavily on my deck building skills in the past to win games, and I needed to prove to myself as a player personally that I could become a better player and not necessarily focus on the fact that I have managed to find a crack in the meta and made a good deck for it, because it's not always possible. And in this meta too, there was very few cracks to be exploited. So I was just going to take a 50% deck. The other reason was, so I have read copious amounts of reports from Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Pokemon, and Wixoss itself from Japan, that a lot of people prefer taking decks with 50% win rates to GPs because they have to perform round after round after round. Yes, you can give a round, you can even give two sometimes, but inevitably it needs to be above average, consistent in what it does. And that goes doubly, I think, in Wecross. Wecross, there's so much random stuff in the meta, and just random things that people are going to play just because they're their favorite decks, and they're not necessarily going to play it just because they've got lopsided matchups or anything. That I wanted a deck that could perform round after round after round, and I always had a shot at victory. And inevitably, this is what did it. This Elrig deck is super solid and didn't change very much at all. At one point in time, I was trying to use Dub instead of anything else here, and there's a world where I tested Machina, the one that gives you the life cloth, as well as using Clap here. Inevitably, I did that a bit because I wanted more Enter, but that Enter was not enough to help me win or lose games. I was still losing games to aggro, and that was gonna be a problem because I will say this, at least 50% of Wecross, different types of aggro, but at least 50% of Wecross is aggro, if not like more like 60%. So it didn't really work out against aggro, and the dub had to swap to clap pretty early on. I figured that out. And then everything else stayed exactly the same. There was some chance that I changed out some of these pieces, Super Celestia Saber and Ultra Superheroes, but inevitably I kept coming back to them after a while. The biggest interesting thing with Super Celestia Saber, sorry, not Super Celestia Saber, with Ultra Superheroes was the mill. For the longest time, I was running 0, and I mean 0 mill cards in my main deck because I just thought Ultra Superheroes was enough to mill on its own, and against any mid-range or Esper deck, it was. Against every single aggro deck that I played against, and reminder, I just said that I thought that the metagame was going to be probably 60% aggro. It was not enough. It always ended up being that there was about 3 cards left in the opponent's library, and I could not mill them out, and I would often get in situations where I just needed 1 more damage to win. In fact, that actually happened to me. The single loss that I had in the tournament structure GP was against the Deus Adams deck that inevitably took 2nd place. What it did was it had 1 single card in its deck left to win, and honestly, there's a lot of times I think back at it, and I was just like, I really wish I Phalaris'd for one of those things there. Adams is difficult sometimes to know whether they're going to mill themselves out or not, and whether getting Phalaris is a waste, you know. But I wish I did, and I probably would have won that game if I did. But yeah, I figured out very late in the game. I mean, we're talking like 4 days before the GP that I needed some amount of mill, and I didn't have time to test. There's 3 cards that I could have chose. Dragon Maid was one of them that I was testing. Inevitably, I chose not to go with Dragon Maid because I just didn't think I had enough black Enter to make Dragon Maid good. Dragon Maid can open up a lane as well as make the opponent refresh, which is kind of nice. The other thing is I was trying was Brutus, which Brutus is a level 2 with no life burst. That when it's in the center lane and attacks, it can mill the opponent 4. And what I found, just generally speaking, was that aggro was around, I said 3, but sometimes was around 5 in my really, really, really rough testing, like a couple days before the GP. So I felt uncomfortable with switching it to that, and I ran Phalaris instead. Looking back at it, I think I could have run Brutus and been fine. There was 1 game that I did mill them out, and I needed the Phalaris because they were at 5 instead of 3. And that, but I think I probably could have won that game anyways. So I don't know if it was the correct move to cut that and just keep Phalaris in here. I just didn't have time to risk it, so I just didn't. But the main thing that I found when I was doing my copious amounts of testing is actually you'll see that there's a ton of walls here. Toyoki started out as a 1 of and is now a 4 of. Mastema I kind of consider a wall because it's 5,000, which means that it doesn't get vanished to the 3,000 or less effects, and that was kind of the ones I was worried about. And so that's 2 more, and then you'll also see that I have Bernasis, which is a 7,000 sometimes, as a 2 of. So if you count these all together, I've got 8 different walls at level 1 that I can use. And then you'll see that I actually have 2 Buckler, which I count as walls in this scenario because they don't get vanished, 2 Hera, Lancelot, etc., and 2 Ishikiri Maru, because again, those are really difficult to get to vanish as well. So that ends our count being on turn 2, we could have anywhere from 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cards that we could put down as walls. I think in the future, if I got some different cards, Ishikiri could go, and I could probably cut 1 Buckler. But right now, they all had their reasoning for sticking around. Ishikiri actually did a lot of work of just helping against the discard decks as well, because they couldn't vanish it very easily. I ended up getting a lot of filtering, which helped me out a lot. But it also just stuck around, and it basically, quote-unquote, drew me a card, because it didn't go anywhere, it drew me a card, and I got to play around sort of that kind of thing. Buckler, I needed the I needed the life burst. There's just not enough damage push in the main deck for this because most of my damage push is coming from Tama attacking. And while again I regret not having enough damage push when I got to my Nova matchup, I can't regret it literally anywhere else. Everywhere else I had an optimum way to win the game, even against the Esper decks. Like yes, they could retool and get themselves guards, but because they were retooling and getting themselves guards, plus Tama uses with its ability enter starves the opponent, it ended up being a thing where okay, so if I gave them a catch-22. They either took 1 damage from my Elrig attack and 1 damage from me opening a lane and attacking through, or it ended up being 2 damage from my Elrig attack because they didn't have the enter to either spend on defending, or they didn't have the enter to spend on getting back guards to their hand. They had to choose one. They could not do both. There was not a single game, and I did play in 2 Esper decks basically. There was not a single game where the opponent had out a 3-stop and they were able to grow the 3-stop. Every single time the opponent had a 3-stop out, they could never grow the 3-stop. They just didn't have the enter. Either because they were focusing on getting guards or doing some other stuff or maybe opening lanes. They just never had the enter. Inevitably, this deck operates basically on a very, very simple function, which is it can either enter starve your opponent, it can wall your opponent out, it can discard your opponent out, or it can damage them out. It can race them. And you usually end up going with 2 of those options and then ignoring the other 2. There was plenty of times where I knew that my opponent had more card draw than I had discard, so I never discarded them. I just never did. I just let them have every single card they could ever possibly want, and I just focused on enter starving them and damaging them. Likewise, there was other times where I would be up against my, I guess also fully defensive is the other function that it does. There was other times where I'd be like, no, I'm just playing the defense here. I'm against the quicker aggro deck, right? A dash or something. And all my enter was spent to defense on the board, getting some what do you call it, guards. But like I never opened a lane with ZR. I would never like use random drain. I would be purposefully enter charging the random drain because I knew I didn't have the enter for it. So I basically flipped on all of those modes depending on the matchup, right? And I even wrote down right before the GP what are the 2 modes I'm doing on with every single archetype, right? That I was expecting to play against. Inevitably, I was expecting to play against a lot of different types, like within the archetypes themselves, but I was basically saying I need to be prepped against red aggro, I need to be prepped against white aggro, I need to be prepped against Esper control, and I need to be prepped against like I said green mid-range, but green mid-range is sort of the better mid-range, I guess, of like white and black mid-range as well. So I just sort of like lumped them all in together there. And then I played enough against Aya that I also kind of knew how to play against, I guess, tempo as well, like this white-blue tempo that I was sort of expecting. Those were the archetypes I was really expecting. And inevitably, I decided if I was up against a red aggro deck, my number 1 mode of function would be defense, and then my second mode of function would be probably damage. I sometimes it would be enter starving, but it would be mostly damage. Because I can't stall out aggro decks forever. They just have too much push, usually, that I would actually need to basically do this sort of like counter attack where I'd block, punch back, block, punch back, block, punch back. Because once you do the math there, inevitably you have you just have more defense than they have offense. But your defense runs out, their offense doesn't, so you need to end the game right as your defense is running out. This is where the white walls came in. Toyoki, Mastema, Buckler, and Ishikiri Maru, and Bernices. Inevitably, Bernices is a little slow in that matchup, so you focus on doing turn 1 Toyoki and Mastema. Then your turn 2 ends up being Toyoki, Ishikiri, and Buckler. And then turn 3 onwards, you usually have enough in the trash that Bernices is a valid option again. And Bernices is just backup. to Tuyoki and Mastema. You also, generally speaking, don't run Mastema after turn 1. It starts just becoming Enter, so that way you can't get Lancelot or Herod at all. And then after that, you basically follow up with defensive options, right? So Exia is the number 1 there. That's why it's got 4 cards there. Occasionally Remembers number 2, and then Orochimaru is either on the second to last turn or the last turn. Depends on if I really need that guard ability here. There were times that like I could have Super Celestia Saber or Ultra Superhero to try to get a guard, and instead I was just like, no, I'll just Orochimaru here. It gives me a 10,000 that's difficult to vanish, and also I just need a guard, and then later I can use the Super Celestia Saber to bring back Phalarist for the win. And that was often how I won those games too. Is I often would put down then a ZR, Phalaris, anything in level 1 or 2, and then go once per game, attack for the win for 1 damage, 2 damage, 3-4 damage with Tama. And then that burst would get me there at the end. Again, it's like I have to win those games before I completely run out of defense. So I'd clap, and then that would be it. Like it'd be like, all right, time to turn on the full stops and go for it. Which is one of the main reasons I ran Phalarus. If I could, that level 2 there would have been better, right? Like then I would have been able to mill them out, ZR and Phalarus them, but it was just against aggro. I needed the mill, so I couldn't risk 4 not being enough. I had to go with Phalarus. There's like a level 3 that mills 6 in the future, and that seems fine because like what you really need to do, the secret number is like 15, right? Like if you can do this plus 5, you probably can win any game through mill. Anyways, the white aggro decks were similar. I did the same exact thing, but inevitably I actually kind of didn't focus on damage as much as I focused on discard. So it was the number 1 thing was blocking damage. Just like I said before, all these white walls are still relevant, but Tuyoki could actually be replaced a bit with Monomin, depending on whether or not I thought I was going to see flash cards in front of me. If I saw flash cards, I usually stuck with the Tuyoki, but Monomin helped, and then I also played some ZRs to like damage them to get some discard. Mono white aggro actually is a little easy to disrupt with discard. Not like 100%. You're never going to get their hand down to 0, but you're going to make things awkward for them. And that's the number 1 part, is if you can make things awkward for them and save off on getting remembered later down the line, which are bad to play against this deck, it helps. So that was the goal, was to play super defensive and then discard a bit. I still wasn't using a lot of extra enter for random drain and things like that, but a lot of times white aggro will burst all their draw in 1, and also they're going to leave a ton of cards in your hand, so Orochimaru becomes a really nice way to just be like, well, thanks for giving me these cards, let me toss them back at you, with the bounce there, and also Monomin, like just basically feeding Monomin constantly and just being super ahead on cards all the time. And then inevitably Exia, right? Exia is just is an absolute, it's even more of a nightmare for mono white than it is for red aggro. Moving right along, when I got myself against sort of like Aya or these Enter Starve tempo decks that were like Umir, stuff like that, I never played one in the GP, but I had a plan, and my plan was pretty simple. It was to focus on defense and drawing cards. And I know that sounds strange, but the drawing cards really mattered because they were super, super hyper aggro discardiness. Like, right, they were getting rid of my cards at a ton. So I just paced out my card draw, right? Like, I slowed out. I didn't Machina Wing Slash very quickly. I didn't Smash very quickly. I didn't Float very quickly. I just waited on all my Super Celestia Sabers, Ultra Superheroes. Basically, all of these were almost like 1 turn apart for like 5 turns of just refueling my hand. So they could get my hand down to 0 and I would be fine every single time. I don't need to mill them here. This mill is enough. They're going to kill themselves with mill anyways. And then I would focus on just making sure I just didn't die to damage. The number 1 thing you had to be careful was if they had Madoka Break, because getting Madoka Break is almost like just impossible to recover from. So as long as you float your hand at around 2 or 3, they can't really easily Madoka Break you, or they can't Madoka Break you well anyways, and then you can kind of just screw them over. Gaebolg is huge in this because they're low on enter anyways, and you can enter starve them really easily with this type of effect. that you just enter starve them. You never try to make them discard because they always got more cards in hand than you. So you just pace out your own draw. You focus on defense because they can't put a clock together. Like, they really can't. And as long as you make sure that they never hit you with their damage, the game will go so long that it'll just twirl back into your favor again. Look, all you got to do is draw a single ZR, or draw a an an Orochimaru, something that opens lanes, and inevitably you just win those games. Like, and Remember's really good there too because you enter starving them the whole time, and they're also just not enter efficient. So you basically just screw them over and force them to double down on their guards. Sometimes you can't always do the double attack with this. That's fine. You just, on those turns, that those aren't the Remember turns, and you wait for the turns that you can do that to play the Remember. Inevitably, it's actually a pretty easy matchup once you know the trick of just pacing out your card draw, so that way you're never like really hurt by them. Then against the, let's see here, the Mirror Esper decks, I found almost everyone wanted to give me Enter, which seems like a mistake. Generally speaking, don't give me Enter. If you give especially the Tama deck Enter, I'll be able to use it. Like, I've got Enter Sinks. Tama is an Enter Sink. Plus, I'll be able to use all my stuff on time, and if I use all my stuff on time, I'm winning those games. Against the Esper decks, my main focus was Enter Starving and damage. Just constantly always making sure I offered damage, so that way it was forcing them to use their guards, forcing them to use their assists, forcing them to do their stuff, catch-22ing them. Then in the late game, my Tama was good enough for it. I actually found that there was less Tama Espers than I thought there was going to be. There's mostly like Madoka Espers, there was some Aya Espers, I saw Yuka Esper, stuff like that. And it was cool that I was seeing all these things, but inevitably it meant that, oh, okay, so basically all I have to do is enter starve my opponents and hit them with the consistent damage, and I'll probably win out. You have to be careful. Sometimes those Esper decks can offer turns where they open up all three lanes, and then you're like, well, shit, I can't Madoka clap this early, and you gotta like sort of like face take the damage. Those games are where you like need to minimize it by smashing, and then superheroes to get a guard, or Super Celestia Saber to get a guard. There are times where against my opponent, they've early discarded me down, and I've used Super Celestia Saber on turn like 2. I don't love those turns, but I prefer to do the Super Celestia Saber rather than give them a toolbox with Ultra Superheroes early. I'm gonna wait until I can mill them out with Ultra Superheroes. I'm willing to be patient for it. And basically in those scenarios too, if you give me the guaranteed guard, I'm gonna take it, whereas Ultra Superheroes is not the guaranteed guard. I normally count my deck, look at how many guards are left in the deck. If the answer is like, there's 20 cards in the deck and there's 3 guards in there, I'll go for Ultra Superheroes at that point. But I need to guarantee that I'm doing fine. And a death sentence is basically playing both of these in one turn because this one didn't get you the guard. Gaebog ends up being a really, really good card in those matchups. Orochimaru is only good at the last turn, sadly. ZR's great in these matchups. A lot of the times I was actually using it to draw myself a card rather than make my opponent discard a card at random, just to keep float my hand up more. Because against other Esper decks, especially the blue-led Esper decks, I just have less discard than they do. I'm a little less discard focused than them, and I'm not really willing to fight over discard, which weirdly helped me out a lot in the GP. I only had a couple games where I was like, yep, I'm the discard deck. Everyone else was like, I'm the wall deck, and I just stalled out. But Gaebog allows you to win that sort of like resource race because you're drawing extra cards, forcing them to make you discard more. You're also trashing stuff, which makes them lose resources. You're probably enter starving them a bit. Inevitably, that's sort of my focus is going to be like Gaebog is what I want. I want Remember. Again, this stretches their enter thin, which is what I like. I often use this look at the top life card. Even if it doesn't change, just because I gotta guarantee that I want these guards to be taxed, and then their actions to be taxed as well. Weirdly enough, there are some times against specifically the Madoka Esper deck where you actually prefer having Exia. This is something that me and Altiers we're testing a lot of prior to the GP. There's some awkward turns where you place down 2 Exias and they go to the Madoka player, and you don't think it would phase them, but they have no real way around it. They have ZRs, which are really good, but they often have other things that target before their attacks to go through, right? Like like Modem or stuff like that that target and get rid of things, and then you've got Exia to block that lane down, which is really nice. Also, what's really important is these Toyokis actually end up being really good because, like I said, with Modem or with ZR, it's difficult to get rid of these. These are 8,000 power. Yes, they are very get riddable with ZR, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I ran ZR over Modem. But it just makes things awkward for them, right? And then these 10Ks or these level 2s that are 10Ks or higher makes it really awkward for them to be able to vanish through. There are actually games where instead of doing a 3-3-1 split, I would do a Exia 2-2 split, and then my opponent would look at it and be like, oh, I'm not getting through with any damage this turn because you have a guard in hand. And you go, yep, Madoka, for what it's worth, also has a target thing. There was some good players, though, that worked around it. They would do things like Yuki target the Exia to make my Exia trigger early, and then would open up the lane with their Madoka through something else. Still, it forces them to work for it, and that's what I'm looking for, is that kind of interaction, make it difficult. So inevitably against the Esper decks, my number one goal was to draw cards, enter starve them, and then basically also make sure I'm dealing damage against them. Because the other thing against Esper decks is if you can actually manage to get, like, I don't know, 4 life cloth stripped away early, and you're still at 5 life cloth, they're really not likely to win anymore. They solidify their amount of guard recursion around turn 3, so if you can sneak that early damage in and avoid getting life bursted, it ends up being really, really in your favor. The Esper deck, or sorry, not the Esper deck, the Adams deck is very similar to that. You sort of do the same thing, although discarding them early has a chance of winning you the game, so you can kind of risk it for the biscuit if you want with the discard there. Otherwise, the correct answer is to wall up against them, make sure that they have to PA, which is difficult for them to do because they're going to lower their hand size, and then their late game is going to be really terrible. I never felt like I was worried about H2O because they just never had the hand that could support H2Os against me. So I always knew I was winning the or at least matched to them in the discard department. They have life bursts that can get cards back to their hand, so it ends up being truly a 50-50, really difficult to work with. And I don't know if I made the correct calls. I would need more Adams deck interaction in order to pull it off. Something I probably should have tested a little bit higher than I did. Against the green enter decks, or just these sort of mid-rangier decks in general, my goal was to basically slow roll the game, which they're going to slow roll it anyways. But if you just keep the constant discard pressure on them, inevitably they've got to use their enter for that. That's also something else I never did against them. I never enter starved against those types of mid-range decks. I was just like, they'll have the enter, and I kind of pushed my way through anyways with damage and never really worried about the enter. They also have to kind of attack you to get rid of annoying cards on your field, right? Like, all of your level 3s are really annoying for them, and they kind of have to. They have no discard really, so they have to actually attack them. So you never really worried about the enter in return. So it ends up being this like bruiser game that you play instead, but you inevitably win it just because you're a little bit more functional. And mid-range decks like that aren't the Esper decks they draw a lot of cards, but they don't have good filtering. So inevitably, the cards that they put out, while they can keep pace with you in terms of putting out cards, if you apply the discard to force them to have to constantly replenish their hand, the value of the cards they put out are lower. And so you just kind of just value them out, right? Like, they're putting out, I don't know, amino acids that are not super great because you already grew your Machina Smash. Meanwhile, you have a Gay Ball out and you have Remembers, and like, that's taxing them and really, really messing with them. Those types of things inevitably helps you out quite a bit. Some other general tips of the deck that I go out of my way to do. Generally speaking, my Super Celestia Saber, my targets usually are against aggro decks or decks that I need to be more defensive against. I pull out a defensive card with my white, I get a guard, and then I usually get just a level 1 in black. Most often Mastema or my Bernices in order to defend against them, just having more level 1s. You'd be surprised if you focus on Ultra Superheroes and Super Celestia Saber and only get your level 3s, you'd be surprised how often you're screwed in terms of limit. So I often would just get a level 1 as potentially discard fodder with Monomin at worst, because I just needed to make sure that I had lanes. Um, was something I learned early on. This deck can really unlimit itself pretty easily. Against the Esper decks, I hopefully use this a little later, but I'm not willing. I'm willing to use it early just to get hand back if I need to. And when I get hand back, I just look for cards that I can play that are pretty good against them. But if I'm using the going against controller or mid-ranger decks, I usually am looking for stuff that will just be really annoying for them to deal with, like Remember or Gay Bog, those types of things. Potentially, I could cut one Exia for a Gay Bog, but I felt like I really needed it for the dash matchups, so I didn't feel comfortable going under four Exias. Um, Very rarely do I actually get Phalaris back with that effect. If I'm going to get Phalaris back, I usually get it with the Machina Smash effect. And it's against like a deck that I think I have the ability to do that again. My main reasoning being my number one thing against the aggro deck is to survive. But in the later, I often had a ton of cards in hand too, and I would see a Phalaris and I would just shuffle it to the front of my hand and be like, "This is for later," and I just wouldn't discard it. I just would hold on to it until the final turn, and then I'd do it with that. I never really got it back with the Super Lestia Saber as much as I thought I would. Yeah, didn't really end up happening all that much. Let me think what other stuff. I think people are Machina smashing too much. I think I Machina smashed out of my 9, what was it, 7 plus 3 games. So my 10 games that I played in the GP, I recurred something back to my hand twice. And one time I actually think it was a mistake. So that shows how much I actually use that second function. It's up against Esper decks that I use it the most. But not Esper decks, I pretty much never use it. It's really only there to get me back a card in hand against them. Very rarely am I like, oh, I need to get something back to salvage against an aggro deck. Because, again, I'm running 4 Exia, so I never felt like the need to get Exia. I usually always had 2 Exia in hand, and then later had 1 Exia plus something else, whether that something else was a Orochimaru or a Remember. I never really felt the need to use it to bring something back. Madoka Clap for 90% of the time was also a 2-stop in the deck. I only used it as a full 3-stop against aggro decks. Everything else it was a 2-stop. Against the Esper decks and even some mid-range decks, it was a 1-stop. It was just a 2-enter 1-stop. However, that being said, I wouldn't have gotten rid of it or changed it with a 2-stop of choice. It was functional every single time. It was very good. I know some people were like swapping Madoka Clap for basically Shield, Deus Shield. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable plan because it stops guards. And in those scenarios, it basically is 3-enter just to guard 1 and stop 1 damage on field against the Esper decks, which is great. Don't get me wrong, that's really good. But I was happy with my Clap. It's boring. It does the job. It was super flexible. Against the aggro decks, stopped all the damage. Against the more slower mid-ranger tempo decks, stopped 2 damage. Against the control decks, stopped 1 damage. I never felt weird about it. I was always fine with it. I never really held on to it either if I needed to. I was very happy to stop 2 damage with the Madoka Clap, especially against the Esper decks. If there was a scenario where I could stop 2 damage with the Madoka Clap or the Esper deck or the Tempo deck, I would be like, yep, that's fine. And I would do it then right away. And then they'd be like, oh, well, maybe I've got the chance to burst through with damage. They never had the chance to burst through with more damage after that. So it was fine. And then against the aggro deck, if I had an option to do it, play it for all 3, I just did. And it was fine. It was good in those scenarios. Sometimes it leaves you a little underhanded, but that's fine. You can remake if you're pacing your draw correctly. You can remake your draw very much. Going into some of these specifically, look, I ended up with 2 ZRs. I think that was the right move. I like ZR a lot now. I didn't like it before I started testing heavily. I was playing a lot of other freer ways to deal damage to the opponent. What I found was that ZR is technically a free way to deal damage to the opponent, which you might be thinking, well, hold on. To do negative 8,000, you need to not only make the opponent discard a card, you also need to pay 1 in order to do it. So that's kind of 2 enter to deal the damage. And to you, I say, yeah, that never happened. It was every single time I put it down, it got removed. before it could attack. Therefore, I never had to pay the enter cost for it. So it is free. When it is not free and the opponent goes, yeah, that's fine, you pay 1 enter, and that saves you an enter here, which this deck is so tight on enter against the decks that did that, and I was tight on enter and needed it, then that meant I had 1 more enter, so instead of having to go with Ultra Superheroes to try to get a guard, I could go with Super Celestia Saber, get more cards in hand against the discard deck, and also ensure that I had the guard. So it worked out every single time. It was very good. I wouldn't go up to 3. I couldn't afford going up to 3. I tried. The dex is just super tight. Phalaris is the last nail in that coffin. I was like, nope, not happening. Phalaris, by the way, I have my counts as pretty clear. I think there's 12 if I remember correctly of level 3s. My Phalaris here was actually just an extra card. I counted it as a spell almost. I had Miracle Draw here before. I never use Phalaris unless I need it. So it was always just either enter or it was a fancy way to mill. And so I never played it as a level 3 and was like, cool, did it. I only played it when the decks I needed it, and that was basically only aggro decks, and I only played it then. I should have played it against Adams. But against Esper, I was like, yeah, they'll kill themselves. They'll refresh themselves. I don't have to worry about it. And it was just always enter or discard fodder. To Bruno, I think the correct number of Bruno in these decks is 2.5. That's my safe way of saying I think there's possibly you need 3, but I don't know how you fit the 3rd one in there with all the other stuff you want. I always wavered between 3 and 2. It did the job I needed it to. I think if I was more discard heavy, I probably would go to 3. But I liked it as the 2 of that I got. I valued it pretty heavily, but I had to make sure that I never used it against the aggro decks or the decks that had Lancelot. Gibolg, I think the correct number there is also probably 2.3. Against the Esper decks, I really would have preferred to have more Gibolg, but this deck has a serious level 3 problem where you can't filter. You just got to hope that you can get them back with the various searches filtering. That it would have been good. I think there's probably a world where you cut Orochimaru and put a Gibolg in there. But again, Orochimaru is also pretty good against the Esper deck, so I like that one. I actually, speaking of Orochimaru, definitely the right answer was 1. It had 2 different modes. Against aggro decks, it was the last push I needed to help win me the game, right? If it wasn't ZR because I was tight on enter and I needed to double down on this Tama attacks, usually against the white decks, mind you, the white aggro decks, because they enter Starve you, it ended up being that I would play a Phalaris, I'd play a Orochimaru, and then I'd win the game with that plus the 2 attacks. Against the Esper decks, this very rarely was a way to win the game, although it could be a way to win the game. Sometimes I would win the game with this. Against the control decks, it ended up being another way to bring guards back to hand. So altogether, I had, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guards that I naturally drew, and then this would be my 6th guard. And it did the job there. It's strange because a lot of people look at this and think, oh, it's not good it's not the best card in any scenario, therefore it must be bad. It was just good enough in the 2 scenarios I needed and had a weakness for that 1 is the correct number. So you can fish it out and stuff. There's a lot of toolboxing in this deck. The Toyoki is a 4 of. I wouldn't change this. Moving into the next 2 sets, probably still a 4 of. This card is phenomenal. Why is this card phenomenal? It's a 3,000 on your turn, which means that you can attack under. And then after that, it's an 8,000, which means that you are enter starving the opponent and then you are walling them, which is great. Rule of thumb, don't put a Toyoki in your center lane. You want your center lane probably to get vanished, so that way you can get enter, especially against opposing Brunos. So you put your 2 Yokis in the other 2 lanes probably. Monomin, that's the one that you can put in the center lane. I did that a bunch. This is just your standard way of making opponents discard. Strips your own hand size down. It's not fantastic, but there's enough ways. Basically, against every other deck, I could strip their hand down if I needed to because of Monomin. Against the Mirror Esper decks in general, that's not going to happen as often. You Monomin, but mostly Monomin to deprive them of being able to use efficient discard against you. But it's not like it's never been my shining goal. It's free. Free is good. Mastema, I would have loved if this was a 1 of in my deck. It ended up being a 2 of in my deck. I just needed more walls and I needed another black enter. So it ended up being that the second Mastema should be in it. some point in the future probably changes. It was correct for this GP. 2 Yuki. 2 Yuki's correct. Against a lot of decks, I like to have 3 Yukis, but Yuki is, by the way, very, very, very good in just almost every matchup. There's a reason to use it. It can move Brunos out of the way. It can vanilla out H2Os. It can stop various annoying, like stop remember. It's got a lot of reasons. I often liked having 1 in hand, 1 in trash if I could help it, and I just left it in hand even if it never was a good scenario to use it. I just always had it as an option, and I liked that a lot. 1 in trash, by the way, is because you hit life burst that brings stuff back from your trash, and you'll want to bring Yukis back when the opponent has assassin and things like that. Lancer. Mastema Orochimaru we talked about. 4 servants are great. 4 servants are good. I used my favorite servants for that event, which is the one with the hat right now. Moving on, it'll eventually be remembers with the what do you call it, the witch hat. That's a cute servant. 3 random drain. I fluctuated between 2 and 3 random drain. 3 was the right call. I didn't have the third Bruno like I wanted, so I ended up going back up to 3 random drain. It was fine. It did good. It did good work. I don't know what else to say there is about random drain. Sometimes you don't use it. There's matchups where you're concerned about enter, and random drain is the worst card in your deck. And in those matchups, you enter charge it. Ishikirimaru, like I said, I think the correct number is probably 2. I think when set 10 comes out, there's a new 12,000 I'm probably going to want instead of Ishikirimaru. But for now, it walled. There's enough aggro in this game that you need to have a significant amount of your walls portioned up. I think I had enough that it was basically 1/4 of my deck that was walls. 4 Exia, probably the wrong number. 3 Exia is probably the correct number. I just couldn't risk it against the aggro decks for this GP specifically, and I think that it is correct for this GP. I think moving forward, I probably cut 1 at my locals or at online events, and then if I was going to go back to the GP, I'd probably consider running 4 again, just because that seems to be when all the aggro really starts coming back out and people aren't like playing mid range and stuff. Buckler as a 2 of. I've always played Buckler as a 1 of in a lot of my decks, but I just needed another wall. I needed another black source, and I needed a life burst that could open a hole. This does all of those things. It opens a hole against Remember specifically as well. There was not a single time I had a Buckler and I didn't feel great about it, which is strange to say because I don't love vanillas anymore. There's not a single time I didn't play it and feel good, enter it and didn't feel good, or hit its life burst and feel great. Its life burst is so good. I think 2 is the right. I think 3 is overboard. Then I've got Remember as a 3 of. So this is got a Nobo play with Exia, right? Because it ups Remember. But the scenarios that you play Remember and the scenarios you play Exia are far enough different that you don't usually play them together, and you have control over them being played in your hand. A lot of the times that you play Exia, those are the times where you're enter charging Remember. A lot of the times that you want to play Remember, those are the times you're enter charging Exia. So they while being a Nobo, and sometimes that is an issue, it's usually less of an issue. You have enough filtering that you get through it. Remember is a great card, fantastic. 3 of was the right call. At one point I was running 1, and I was like, yeah, it's not that great because I never really saw it. Then I realized how powerful playing 2 Remember is together against Adam's decks specifically, and I was like, nope, this is great. And then I played enough against control decks and other also like X decks, like there was a fair amount of DXM, and this card devours that matchup. So I ended up going to 3 of. I wonder if 4 is the right option. Like, I wonder if the correct move is cut Nexia and put another Remember in there. I could be a crazy person. I'm a little more aggressive in terms of play style with this deck than most people are, and it actually helped me out quite a bit in the GP. I think I played the balance between defensive and aggressive pretty well. One of the problems with playing completely defensive is when you become completely passive, games can kind of run away from you that you were in control of earlier on. So I never felt like that. I've always felt like I've always put in the correct amount of damage and never really skimped on it. So I don't know, maybe 3 is the right call. Maybe it's the 3-3 split and something else. Bernices is probably one of the more interesting cards that you can play. It's the opposite of Toyoki. Toyoki is great because it can attack under and then is defensive on your opponent's turn. Bernices is weird because you never play it in the early game against aggro decks. You you play it in the late game against aggro decks, and it's a wall against them then. In the early game, however, against Esper, you don't really care because Toyoki sticks around so long against them that you don't really care if you have this in play or not. So what you end up doing is you play it really early for the mill. And opponents sometimes work around it because they're just too scared of the mill. And so you just play it really early to be vanished. Specifically, I put this in front of Bruno all the time. To be like, yeah, go ahead. You can make me discard a card, but you'll mill 2 and I'll get an enter off of it. And that's where it really shines. And then later on against the Esper deck, if you somehow are running out of Toyokis in the late game, then you have Bernices that you can put in to at least expedite the game. Really guarantee that your mill will get there, or it will just stay there and then never get vanished, and then you'll never have to. It's basically one less card you have to draw all the time. Talking about the limits here again, I almost always went with a 3-3-1 split. Which meant that on my turn 2 defense step, I was always Machina smashing or clapping against the aggro. Like, it was one aggro deck. It was the dash deck specifically. I clapped on turn 2 defense step. Pretty much everything else I held it, and I didn't feel bad about that. I guess I held it. Smash was the thing that I did almost unanimously on against every deck. There's almost no point in time that between defense step 2 and defense step, I guess 3, that the opponent's not offering themselves at least one open lane that you can shut down with a smash. I was never afraid to do it early. I knew that they were probably holding off on Phalaris's or Gaybogs or Remembers, and by smashing early, I was denying my chance of telling them to work around it and that potential long game advantage. But the long game advantage of being able to slap down 2 Remembers yourself into level 1 Toyoki is too strong to pass up. And I found a lot of players not growing on their thing, and I think that's wrong. There are some scenarios where it's correct to just not do it and slow roll it. But I played 10 games every single time on my turn 2 defense step, someone offered an open damage lane so I could shut it down with Machina. And it was worth it every single time, because then there was other times, especially against the more mid-range decks, where they would do plus to their Signy, and they would get it out of Machina range, and I'd be like, yeah, it's too late. I've already used it, and I've already got my value out of it, so it doesn't matter. Likewise, there was a lot of ways to stop Machina, especially against Stop Sign, which I think was underplayed in this event, that in my testing, I was just be like, yeah, I'm going to smash right now, because there would also be times where they would play level 2, level 3, and I would just not have Machina Wing Slash here. So I would do it. I would do it pretty quickly, either to get back a utility card or get me back food for Monoman, or sometimes 6 my hand so I can get another Toyoki against the aggro deck. Against the aggro deck, it's my dash deck. I basically floated, smashed, and also superheroes, like all within a single turn. Overloaded my hand to almost like 10 cards in hand that I had to discard down to, just so I could find my Toyoki setup. And it did the job. It stopped the opponent, and I won that game. But yeah, so I'm willing to blow my hand against the aggro deck specifically. Against Esper control, I wasn't. Yeah, so the 3-3-1 was the correct move. I talked about how I was pretty willing to blow one of my 2 pieces pretty early on, but then I would sandbag on the other one. If I blew one of my pieces early on, I always wanted to sandbag on the second one, just because that's sort of the way the flow of the game goes. And it becomes really important, especially against these long mirrors, to have some form of advantage of if you're not snowballing on your turn, you're not winning that game. So you need to basically be like, if I could put out a field, and my field is Ishikiri, Maru, Tokioki, and the Monoman, it's not a good enough field. I need to find something that's like a Gaybog or something like a Remember here. So I'm gonna blow one of these to make sure I can get that turn. You just gotta snowball in those scenarios. I think that basically goes over everything that's involved in the deck. I don't know. I'm doing stream of consciousness for this. I hope this is enough for you guys to basically be like, this unlocks a lot of ways of how to play. Maybe I'm playing too passive, and that's the reason I'm losing my games with Tama. I think Tama's really, really, really good. Whether Tama is better than Madoka, I don't know. I think it is, personally, because I think Madoka gives up, it becomes a little bit more free to use its enter. However, it ends up giving up its clock, and I feel uncomfortable being a control deck without a clock. Especially because then it makes some more lopsided matchups where, like, one of the things I was hearing a lot was that the Madoka players are having some trouble with aggro, and in testing, anyways. I don't know if that happened in the GP. And I was like, yeah, I don't have any problem with aggro because I'm able to damage them on an equal amount and out defense them that I will win those games. And also against some mirror stuff where I'm like, I will, like, even if I have bad draws, I still have access to dealing damage to the opponent, and I valued that a lot. So I think it's not. I think Madoka is different. I don't know if it's necessarily better. I think it's better, and I think it's worse in certain aspects. When Remember comes around next set as a center, I also still don't know if Tama is better than Remember. I think Remember is maybe a hair better. Remember has like unfiltered, like unbridled filtering power. And I think what that could inevitably mean is that I could probably trim down on some numbers, like trim down on Exia numbers, maybe trim down on some of like this Mastema numbers, maybe trim down on like my Ishikiri buckler numbers, and like, okay, now that I will always hit my walls, or now that I'll always hit my discard, or now that I'll always hit my removal, I can add more toolbox into the deck that will make it better for me with Remember, while knowing that I don't necessarily need the damage because the filtering will get me the clock that I need for my control deck. So it's definitely worth testing, something that I'm willing to test for the next GP, but that's where my brain's at. As far as the next GP goes, probably would run to this type of deck again, just because of how well it played. I don't think there's a ton offering that is different. I think if I was going to make a difference choice, I probably would either consider Deus, DXM Deus aggro, or I would consider a Adams deck. Those are where my brain thoughts are. Anyways, if you guys have any specific questions about playing this type of deck, maybe you guys are trying to run it and it's just not working out for you, I probably have pretty good answers to give you for this one. So go ahead and leave the comments down below.